So an interesting thing seems to be happening. Today, the 29th, is when I'm recording this. I'm reading my note on my board. There was a Rasmussen poll. It was a national poll, and the poll is of black likely voters. And as of today, they polled at 31% supporting Trump. So that's actually a huge number among African Americans. So in 2016, Trump only polled 8% of the black vote. So what does that mean? So and the Trump does not equal the Republican Party. Often the president does. Often you would think the Republican presidential candidate is very representative of the Republican Party and how the party is seen. And usually you would think the Democrat candidate would very much represent what is thought of the thinking of the Democrat Party and etc. But I think in this case there's something a little bit outside of that, because Trump is an outsider. He's clearly an outsider. He's disliked by a lot of Republicans. He's certainly disliked by a lot of the Republican establishment, old guard, the George Bushes of the world. The Bushes, Junior and Senior, have both said that they're voting for Biden. That tells you how far off. You go, wait a second, they agree more with Biden than they do with Trump? No, not from a policy standpoint. Trump has been very much directly in line with the Republican Party, especially modern Republican Party. The Republican Party of today doesn't have a significant problem with Trump's stance on things like prison reform and those sorts of things. That's not a significant issue that there would be a stance against among Republicans. So the Republicans who disagree with him, what do they disagree with him on? They just don't like him personally. He's an outsider. The Republicans have actually, these old guard Republicans, have actually not stood up for conservative values at all. They've been big spenders. They have been big government. They have expanded the administrative branch, and they are pro regulation and policymakers and all those sorts of things. So they've really let down traditional conservatives, and because of that, they don't stand with Trump at all. They dislike Trump there. So just as you can't say that the support that Trump gets does not equal the support the Republican Party gets. I believe in many ways Trump is getting far more support among conservatives than the Republican Party as a whole gets. So what does that mean about the black support for Trump? Because I think Trump is getting a lot of interesting support among African Americans. The question is what does it mean in the broader sense? Because we're about to finish this election and somebody's going to be elected president. But this movement of the black community in support of Trump, what does that mean in the greater sense? Does it mean anything? I think it definitely means two things. It means that they like Trump, and Trump's policies have been good for the African American community. That cannot be denied. No matter what the Democrats try to say, it can't be denied. Record levels of unemployment for the African American community before we get hit with a pandemic. And the rest of the minority community, by the way. So his policies have been good. His prison reform, these sorts of things, have been very much positive for the African American community. So will they see Republicans the same way? I don't know. Here's the other thing it means, though, is it is clearly a sign of rejection of the Democrat Party. The Democrats have had almost universal support from the African American community, and that's not made total sense. Historically, it hasn't made sense. The Democrat Party is the party of the KKK, no matter what people want to say today. The KKK was founded by leading elements of the Democrat Party from the Old South after the Civil War. and there were KKK members in the Democrat Party until fairly recently. Senator Byrd being the most prominent example, and that's not even a secret. So there's been that. The other thing that's been really interesting is in most modern times, in the most current times, since the 1960s at least, the Democrat Party has become very much the party of people who are anti-religion, anti-faith, anti-religion, and very much in the sense of large swaths of the Democrat Party are atheist. It's where the atheist science community has found themselves. The atheist academic community has found themselves. And more so, if you look at the Democrat platform, God has been shoved farther and farther out of there. And it's widely discussed among Democrats, these anti-religious concepts that people of faith are stupid, they're uneducated, etc. And traditionally, the African American community, faith has been a big part of their cultural existence in America. And if you look at Christians, the African Americans in the Christian community, they have very much been the home of much of the more conservative Christian theology. That it's a deep felt, very spiritual, very conservative Christian concept, and that doesn't jive with the Democrat Party at all. So it's been an area that there's been huge gap between that, and it's been ignored because the African American community has been led down a path of saying the Democrats are the only people who do anything for them. And so the largest areas of African American population in the country, in the large cities of the country, have been nigh on universally Democrat for the last 70 years. And the thing that's happening today that is when the African American community has begun to speak positively about Trump, and it's a very interesting thing. If 3 years ago, okay, that's a year after Trump's elected, if 3 years ago I'd have said, what's the likelihood we see a rapper come out publicly in support of Trump? People would say zero. That's nuts. That you're not going to see hip hop artists, that there's just no way. The two couldn't possibly meet. And today another one came out in support, that it's an expanding community of people, of dignitaries, of celebrities in the African American community willing to speak out positively about Trump. And there is no way to speak positively about Trump without speaking negatively about the Democrats. And so they've got to have a story there, and the story is the failure of the failure of the Democrat Party to serve African American needs. That unemployment's been incredibly high, the destruction of the black family in America, etc. And I'm seeing that spoken about more and more. So the question is no matter what happens, let's say Biden wins the election, does this 31% of the African American community just fall in line and go back to the Democrat Party? And I don't see how they do, because of the fact that this movement has required a discussion of and an awakening of actual problems that are being seen in a way that I hadn't seen in my lifetime among the African American community. It's interesting. One of the other things you're seeing in the news a lot is right now we have this turmoil going on in inner cities. We're seeing the answer to everything is to loot and burn things and whatever. And many of the loudest voices speaking out against that have been African Americans from the communities being decimated. And they're seeing that the destruction is being made possible by the fact that the Democrat leadership of these cities, and as best I can tell, every one of these rioting situations, every one of these these large-scale destructive incidences have happened in entirely Democrat-led places where there are nigh on zero Republicans in power. They're they're not in charge of the transportation. They're not in charge of police forces. They're not in charge. They have nothing. There's no mayors, of course, but they're mostly in places with Democrat mayors, Democrat governors, Democrat city councils, Democrat county commissions. These places are as, let's put it this way, the people who vote Democrat, including the African Americans who traditionally voted Democrat, have won every single election for the last 70 years. So why are they so pissed off about the leadership that's going on? And for the first time in my lifetime, they're looking to the people in charge and going, wait a second, there's something similar about all of them. Oh, they're all Democrats. Maybe the answer doesn't lie with the Democrat Party anymore. That's a really interesting thing to me. Now, what's going to come out of it? I don't know, because the Republican Party has been seen so negatively, and in many ways the Republican Party's been so similar, that the question is are they going to find an answer there? I think the answers are there. The question is can the Republican Party capitalize on this, or is it just Trump that's capable of capitalizing on this? Because there are movements right now. I have read that there are movements for a black party, for instance, which is not a good thing for America. We don't need to divide anymore based upon race, but you can certainly see the concept of going, okay, we're going to start a party that's about what we need and what we want. And if the Republicans don't make a serious plug as to why that's them, then the thing that's natural would be to create something else. And the problem with the Republicans needing to step up and make a good argument is the African American community creating their own political party is not bad for Republicans. So the Republicans might not be as motivated as I would really like them to be, because if it really is true 30% of the African American community is leaving the Democrat Party, Democrats are in great big trouble long term, because that's been a huge chunk of their base. That's a monumentally large number. And if you split it, what you're not going to see necessarily cities taken over by the African American Party. What you're going to see is if we take Washington State, Dino Rossi, Republican, lost out to Christine Gregoire running for governor of the state of Washington by the narrowest margin of any governor's race in American history. So Washington State is seen as wildly liberal, and yet just a cycle or two ago, we had a situation where a Republican came that close to winning. So if in King County, where Seattle is in Washington State, if a third or more of African Americans split off to vote for a third party, and that happens for Washington State goes Republican right away. It's an easy move that switches over there. And so I think that's the sort of thing where this could have long-term effect. It could have long-term effect whether or not the Republicans get this, or whether or not this is just a rejection of the Democrat Party. And I think right now the things that we can say for sure is there's a rejection of the failure of the Democrat Party among the African American community. And we can definitely say the results of Trump's work has been so stark that even lifetime long Democrat African Americans are becoming pro-Trump, because his successful results can't be denied, to the point where something as shocking as them turning to a Republican named Trump is a shocking thing. So how it will affect long term, I'm not sure, but it's definitely fascinating. Of the things that are going on right now, to me, that is one of the most fascinating things that's happening, because whether the poll numbers turn out, I don't believe poll numbers at all right now. That's one, really, without a doubt, if Trump wins this election, we should see the death of polling in America. As far as we've seen it It shouldn't matter anymore. It should go away because that will be enough cycles in a row where they've been clueless. So I'm not putting any stake on that 31% or anything. What I am putting my stake on is something significant is happening because voices in the African American community whose livelihoods depend upon popularity in that community have been willing to speak pro-Trump in the last 6 months without fear of that ending their careers and ending their record sales and things like that. That is a monumental change in America right now. And that will be interesting to watch going forward, to see how it affects. Because even if the Democrats, let's say the Democrats get their wish, the Democrats get stronger majority in the House, they take over the Senate, and they take over the presidency, they will take over total control over a country with a massive African American community who's really unhappy with everything they're planning on doing. Everything they plan on expanding into the country is exactly what we're seeing in large metropolitan areas of the country. And the people, the population which is most densely inhabited those areas are rejecting those policies right now. That to me is one of the interesting things to be looking at in this, the 2020 election, and how will we look back upon it 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now, 30 years from now. That to me, I think, is one of the most stark things we're seeing right now, is historic levels of change among the larger minority population as well. We could talk sometime about similarly about the relationship between the Latino population and the Democrat Party, which has very similar issues with religion and so forth. But right now, what we're seeing with black likely voters is an amazing aberration to traditional placement of party in American politics.